Death, taxes, and a Jason Schreier article. He will always seemingly put out an article about a studio's debacle or about why a game didn't succeed in the way that it was supposed to succeed or that the studio thought it was going to succeed. And he did the same with Dragon Age, a series that I am very fond of. I am a huge fan of Dragon Age in general. Obviously, Veilguard did not succeed the way they wanted it to, the way that a lot of journalists talking about the game wanted it to succeed. And I think a big part of that, number one, was obviously the writing. I think it was absolutely abhorrent at points. The writing was very bad. But number two, I just don't think it was very Dragon Age. It wasn't a Dragon Age feeling game. I think it was very different. Granted, all of the Dragon Age games are different from each other, but it was different in tone, and it was different in the audience that it was trying to capture and wanted to play that game. That wasn't the Dragon Age audience. So let's take a look at this article and just see what Jason Schreier is saying. So in early November, on the eve of the crucial holiday shopping season, staffers at the video game studio Bioware were feeling optimistic. After an excruciating development cycle, if you guys remember, this game was originally going to be a multiplayer live service game. But after the development cycle, they had finally released their game Dragon Age the Veilguard, and the early reception was largely positive. I would say the early reception was extremely mixed. The early reception with content creators playing the game was positive, but this was a very different game than what ended up coming out. They played only the good parts of the game, and there was a lot in between there that they were kind of misled into thinking really was actually pretty good, or they didn't even think there was anything in between the sections they played. They thought these were kind of back to back to back, and the whole game was going to be like that. Role-playing game was topping sales charts on Steam, and solid, if not spectacular, reviews were rolling in. Again, this needs to be noted. This is only from Metacritic's, like, in general, and actual gaming journalists out there posting articles on things like IGN and Eurogamer, for example. Positive reviews were not necessarily, quote-unquote, rolling in regards to what content creators were talking about. There was a few with really good reviews, but not a overabundance by any means. I would say it was very mixed, kind of leaning more towards negative. But in the weeks that followed, the early buzz cooled as players delved deeper into the fantasy world, and some of BioWare's employees grew anxious for months. Everybody at the subsidiary of the video game publisher EA had been under intense pressure. The studio's previous two games, Andromeda and Anthem, had flopped, and there were rumors that if Dragon Age underperformed, BioWare might be another one of EA's many casualties. Yes, this was a very big thing. This was a very big conversation. But I think a lot of people were nervous before this game launched, not necessarily just after. Not long after Christmas, the bad news surfaced. EA announced in January that the new Dragon Age had only reached 1.5 million players, missing the company's expectations by not 10, 20%, 50%. They had half the amount of players that they wanted hopping into this game. The holiday performance of another recently released title, EA Sports FC 2025, was also subpar, compounding the problem. Now, I do want to go back to this 1.5 million players. If the reviews for this game were good across the board, there would have been more than 1.5 million players. There were a lot of actual issues with the game, specifically in regards to Dragon Age fans and their views of this game, which were reasons why people didn't want to hop in and play the title. As a result of the struggling titles, EA Chief Executive Officer Andrew Wilson explained the company would be significantly lowering its sales forecast for the fiscal year ahead. EA's share price promptly plunged 18%. That's a lot. Dragon Age had a high-quality launch. I still disagree with that, and was well-reviewed by critics and those who played. Again, I still disagree with that. I do not think it was well-reviewed. It was extremely mixed, leaning towards negative, especially on the content creator side of things. However, it did not resonate with a broad enough audience. This is not true. It had nothing to do with the broad audience it was trying to hit. It didn't resonate with the Dragon Age audience. The Dragon Age audience was not interested in Veilguard. Plain and simple. Days after the sales revision, EA laid off a chunk of BioWare's staff at the studio's headquarters in Edmonton, Canada, and permanently transferred many of the remaining workers to other divisions. For the storied 30-year-old game maker, it was a stunning fall that left many fans wondering how things had gone so haywire and what might come next for the stricken studio. According to interviews with nearly 24 people who worked on Dragon Age the Veilguard, there were several reasons behind its failure, including marketing misfires, poor word of mouth, and 10-year gap since the previous title. All of those are relatively true. I think there were definitely more than this. I don't think the marketing misfires right before launch. They put a couple really good trailers before launch, but marketing in regards to the content creators and bringing them to the event and then showing them and misleading them about what the game is going to be like in that event was a huge misfire. And then obviously those really early trailers were also huge misfires because, again, it was showing the tone of what the game ended up being, which was not a Dragon Age, dark, gritty, medieval, dark fantasy type of game that the previous Dragon Age games, the ones that garnered the audience in the first place, were. Above all, sources point to the rebooting of a product from a single-player game to a multiplayer one, as I mentioned, and then back again. A switcheroo that muddled development and inflated the title's budget, they say, ultimately setting the stage for EA's potentially unrealistic sales expectations. A spokesperson for EA declined to comment. So I'm guessing because of this switch, they just expected this game, not necessarily expected the game to sell more, but were hopeful that the game would recoup the money back. But it's almost impossible when you switch it single player to multiplayer back to single player. And there were a lot of remnants, not as many as I thought there were going to be, but there were definitely a lot of those multiplayer remnants in the game. The union between Bioware and EA started off with lofty aspirations. In 2007, EA executives announced they were acquiring Bioware and another gaming studio in a deal worth $860 million. The goal was to diversify their slate of games, which was heavy in sports titles, obviously like Madden NFL, FIFA that we just talked about, and light in the kind of adventure and role-playing games that Bioware was known for. Initially, it looked like a smart move thanks to a string of big hits. In 2014, they released Inquisition, the third installment in a popular action series dropping players in a semi-open world full of magic elves, dragons, etc., etc. The fantasy title went on to win the most coveted Game of the Year award. I believe that was the first ever Game of the Year award, and sell 12 million copies, or the first ever of this new Game of the Year. According to its executive producer, a major validation of EA's diversification strategy. Now, going back to Inquisition, Inquisition was a lot more similar to Dragon Age Origins. The characters didn't look different. There wasn't a huge change in tone. The game was open world. There was a little bit of open world bloat, especially in the hinterlands at the beginning of the game. There was a ton of that. But overall, the game was nowhere near as big of a departure in regards to tone, in regards to writing, in regards to the characters, in general, that Veilguard was. It was a completely different game in that aspect. Before long, Dara and Mike Laidlaw, the creative director, began kicking around some ideas for the next Dragon Age, codenamed Joplin, aiming for a game that would be smaller in scope, but before much could get done, Bioware shifted the studio's focus to more pressing titles coming down the pike. 2017, Bioware released Andromeda. Andromeda was obviously a horrible release, the fourth installment in a big-budget action series set in space, unlike its critically acclaimed predecessors. The game received mediocre reviews and was widely mocked by fans. A few months after the disappointing release, the head of Bioware stepped down and was soon replaced by Microsoft Incorporated's Casey Hudson, an alumni of Bioware's early formative years, which, in my opinion, at the time was a very good sign. Like much of the industry, EA executives were growing increasingly enamored of so-called live service games such as Destiny and Overwatch, in which players continue to engage with and spend money on a title for months or even years after its initial release. With EA aiming to make a splash in the fast-growing category, Bioware poured resources into Anthem, a live service shooter game that checked all the right boxes. Not for the people that played the game. It checked the right boxes for Bioware, specifically for EA, just trying to force a live service to work within the market instead of letting that happen organically and throwing all this money at a game that probably wasn't actually going to be that profitable in the first place, given that the first trailer that they showed was completely fake. Now, this does happen for some games, but apparently that stressed out the studio immensely, and they were never able to really catch up to where that game initially, when it was shown, was supposed to be. Now, moving forward, one day in 2017 in October, Laidlaw summoned his colleagues into a conference room and pulled out a few pricey bottles of whiskey. The next Dragon Age sequel, he told the room, would also be pivoting to an online live service game. I hope they got slammed that night, because that is big tough. A decision from above that he disagreed with. Thank God he disagreed with it, at least. At least he disagreed with it. He was resigning from the studio. Wow. Which we all kind of knew. The assembled staff stayed late through the night, drinking and reminiscing about the franchise they loved. Of course, it was never going to be the same. I wish that pivot had never occurred. Darrow would later recount on YouTube. EA said, Mike, this is a live service. We said, we don't know how to do that. We should basically start the project over. Former art director Matt Goldman replaced Laidlaw as creative director, and with a tiny team began pushing ahead on a new multiplayer version of Dragon Age. When you have like one of the Dragon Age creators, someone who used to work at Bioware and created amazing games and has a lot of fondness for this franchise, telling you that this is not going to work and then leaves the studio because of that, you should probably take that as a hint that it wasn't going to work. But this codename was Morrison. While everybody helped to finish Anthem, which was struggling to coalesce, Goldman pushed for a pulpy, more lighthearted tone than previous entries. Absolutely the worst call you possibly could have made for a Dragon Age game. The worst call you could have made. With Shoot It, an online game, I don't understand why online games can't be dark in tone and can't keep the tone and keep the environment style and the characters similar to what they were in their single-player versions. That's what is going to draw people into a multiplayer version of the game. If you have things that kind of point back and are similar and not changed from the game that these people loved in its single-player version. It is what it is. It suited an online game, but was drastic departure from the dark dynamic stories that fans loved in the fantasy series. Just reading that, this is like all this article needs to say. This is probably the core of why the game did not resonate with hardly anybody. In February 2019, BioWare released Anthem. Reviews were scathing, calling the game tedious and convoluted. Fans were similarly displeased on social media. Players demanded to know why a studio renowned for their beloved stories and characters had made an online shooter with a scattershot narrative. Ask EA. Don't ask BioWare, ask EA. EA is the one that is making them do this. In the wake of BioWare's second consecutive flop, which I can't even really blame BioWare for because, again, they had to do it, the multiplayer version of Dragon Age continued to take shape. Why? While the previous games in the franchise had featured tactical combat, not all of them, Dragon Age 2 did not, this one would be all action. Instead of quests that players would only experience once, it would be full of missions that could be replayed repeatedly with friends and strangers. Oh my god. Who the hell thought this was a good idea? This would have, if they released it as a multiplayer, it would have done even worse. It would have been Suicide Squad, the Justice League, but for Dragon Age. Insane. Important characters couldn't die because they had to persist for multiple players across never-ending gameplay. Like, it's just so depressing. It's so depressing that their minds even went here. Depressing. As the game evolved over the next 2 years, the failure of Anthem hovered over the studio. Were they making the same mistakes? Absolutely. Some BioWare employees scoffed that they were simply building Anthem with dragons. That's exactly what they were doing. And that's almost exactly what happened, although it wasn't multiplayer elements. Throughout 2020, the pandemic disrupted the game's already fraught development. In December, Hudson, the head of the studio, and Darrow, the head of the franchise, resigned. They should have, and I'm happy they got out of that before this game ended up releasing. Shortly thereafter, Gary McKay, BioWare's new studio head, revealed yet another shift in strategy. Moving forward, the next Dragon Age would no longer be multiplayer. This was the best decision they could have made. And I will say, I didn't hate the Veilguard. I've been talking a lot of shit on it because it's unfortunate that it couldn't have been even better. But I didn't hate the Veilguard. I hated the writing. I did not like pretty much all of the characters in the game. But I actually enjoyed the action, and I actually enjoyed the progression within the game. I didn't think it was actually that bad. I actually did really enjoy it. I thought you could make a lot of different builds, a lot of cool, very unique builds with your character. It was just a bummer because that's not what these games are known for. That's not what Dragon Age or BioWare is known for. And in general, they try to still have the things that they are known for, just done extremely poorly. So you still had to force yourself through those sections. And it was a bummer. We were thinking, does this make sense? Does this play into our strengths? Or is this going to be another challenge we have to face? McKay later told Bloomberg News. No, we need to get back to what we're really great at. And I think they probably tried their best, but it was probably too far gone. In theory, the reversion back to Dragon Age's tied and true single-player format should have been a welcome news inside BioWare, but there was a catch. Typically, this kind of pivot would be coupled with a reset and a period of pre-production, allowing the designers to formulate a new vision for the game. Instead, the team was asked to change the game's fundamental structure and recast the entire story on the fly, according to people familiar with the new marching orders. They were given a year and a half to finish and told to aim for as wide a market as possible. So in my opinion, if they tried to go dark, EA probably would have said no. They had to do what EA was telling them to do, and that's ended up what happened. The strict deadline became a recurring problem. The development team would make decisions believing they had less than a year to release the game, which severely limited the stories they could tell in the world they could build. Then the title would inevitably be delayed for a few months, at which point they'd be stuck with those old decisions with no chance to stop and reevaluate what was working. Jesus, man. At the end of 2022, amid continually dizzying leadership changes, the studio started distributing an alpha build of Dragon Age to get feedback internally from outside playtesters. According to people familiar with the process, the reactions were concerning. The game's biggest problem, early players agreed, was a lack of satisfying choices and consequences. So they hand-fisted all of the choices and consequences to the first 2 hours of the game and the last 2 hours of the game. I guess that's all the time they had. Previous Bioware titles have presented players with gut-wrenching decisions, with which allies to save, which factions to spare, which enemies to slay. Such dilemmas made fans feel like they were shaping the narrative, historically a big draw for many Bioware games. But Dragon Age's multiplayer roots limited such choices. According to people familiar with the development, Bioware delayed the game's release again while the team shoehorned in a few major decisions. Of course, just a few. There was literally some at the start, some at the end, and yeah, like one in the middle, which you had to choose between, like it says here, 2 cities to save from a dragon attack, which really didn't change much about the game in general. But because most of the parameters were already established, the designers struggled to pair the newly retrofitted choices for players with meaningful consequences downstream, and all of these consequential decisions were pretty much ham-fisted into these playtests that they brought the content creators to as well, thinking that the whole game, again, like I mentioned, was going to be exactly like that. In 2023, to help finish Dragon Age, Bioware brought in a second internal team, which was working on the next Mass Effect game. For decades, there had been tension between the two well-established camps, known for their starkly divergent ways of doing things. Bioware developers like to joke that Dragon Age crew was like a pirate ship, meandering and sometimes traveling off course, but eventually reaching the port. In contrast, the Mass Effect group was called the USS Enterprise, after the Star Trek ship, because commands were issued straight down from the top and executed zealously. Hold on. I don't know if that's a bad thing, depending on who's making those commands, but if these are good decisions and they get done, and they get done well, it's probably a good thing. I would rather be on the Mass Effect side there. As the Mass Effect directors took control, they scoffed that the Dragon Age squad had been doing a shoddy job and began excluding their leaders from pivotal meetings. Whoa, what? According to people familiar with the internal friction, that's insane. Over time, the Mass Effect team went on to overhaul parts of the game and design a number of additional scenes, including a rich, emotional finale that players loved. Hold on. If the Mass Effect team did this, that's the best part of the game. The end is the best part of the game. And it seemed like one of the best endings to a Bioware game and right out of Mass Effect, if you've played Mass Effect. So it's interesting that the Mass Effect team was the one who did this. Very, very interesting in my opinion. But even changes that appeared to improve the game stoked the simmering rancor inside Bioware, infuriating Dragon Age leaders who had been told they didn't have the budget for such big, ambitious swings. So they just didn't know how to do it. If Bioware, Mass Effect side of Bioware, was able to do it within the budget, and Dragon Age team didn't think they could do it within the budget, they just weren't figuring it out. They just weren't figuring it out. That's what I'm getting from this. But moving on, it says it always seemed that when Mass Effect team made its demands and meetings with EA regarding the resources it needed, it got its way, said David Gator, a former lead writer on the Dragon Age franchise who had left before development of the new game started. But Dragon Age always had to fight against the headwinds. Interesting. That doesn't necessarily make sense to me. I guess maybe for the previous Mass Effect games it makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is if the Mass Effect team was helping with Dragon Age, wouldn't that be a good thing? Because then you'd get expanded budget to help out the game you're making. I don't know. It's not good that obviously either of them had to fight for that. But regardless. Early testers and Mass Effect leads complained about the game's snarky tone. Oh my god, yes. A style of the video game storytelling, once ascendant, that was quickly falling out of fashion in pop culture, but had been part of Goldman's vision for the multiplayer game. A terrible vision. Worried that Dragon Age could face the same outcome as Forspoken, a recent title that had been hammered over its impertinent banter. It had almost the identical type of release Forspoken had in regards to its tone and its characters and how they communicated. Bioware leaders ordered a belated rewrite of the game's dialogue to make it sound more serious. What? Where was the rewrite? Where was the rewrite? Maybe just at the end? I don't know. In the end, the resulting tonal inconsistencies would only add to the game's poor reception with fans. Yeah, but I thought the tone was pretty much Disney like the whole way through. Literally until the end, of course. A mass layoff at Bioware and mandate to work overtime depleted morale, while a voice actor strike limited the writer's ability to revise the dialogue and create new scenes. An initial trailer made the next Dragon Age seem more like Fortnite, than a dark fantasy role-playing game, triggering concerns that EA didn't know how to market the game. That's what I talked about. That's the first trailer. When the first trailer came out, it was really rough. Now we're getting to the release when Dragon Age the Veilguard finally premiered on Halloween 2024. After many internal delays, some staff members thought there was a lot to like, including the game's new combat system, but players were less impressed and sales sputtered. The reactions of the fanbase are mixed, to put it gently, said Katie, a popular Dragon Age YouTuber. Some, like myself, adore it for various reasons. Others feel utterly betrayed by certain design choices, and that's where I was getting with in regards to the reviews. They were not overly positive unless you're only looking at game journalists. If you're looking at the content creator side, I think it was mixed, more leaning towards negative. Following the layoffs and staff reassignments at Bioware earlier in the year, a small team of a few dozen employees is now working on the next Mass Effect. And it's said to not be anywhere near the tone of what Dragon Age is. After 3 high-profile failures in a row, questions linger about EA's commitment to the studio. In May, the company relabeled its Edmonton headquarters from a Bioware office to a hub for all EA staff in the area. Historically, Bioware has never been the most important studio at EA, which generates more than $7 billion in annual revenue, largely from its sports games and shooters, obviously. Depending on the timing of its launches, Bioware typically accounts for just 5% of EA's annual bookings. Honestly, let go of them, let another company get them, so they can do what the hell they want, according to estimates by Colin Sebastian, an analyst with Robert W. Baird & Co. Even so, there may be strategic reasons for EA to keep supporting Bioware. Strategic single-player role-playing games are expensive to make, but can lead to huge windfalls when successful, as demonstrated by recent hits. Cyberpunk after it got fixed, Elden Ring, Baldur's Gate 3, throw in Expedition 33 in there as well, throw in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 in there as well. You can throw in tons of different games. Single-player games have been popping off. In order to grow, EA needs more than just sports franchises, says TD Cohen. Analyst Doug Kreutz, I don't know how to say any of these last names, trying to fix its fantasy-focused studio may be easier than starting something new. That said, if they shuttered the doors tomorrow, I wouldn't be totally surprised. Kreutz added, it has been over a decade since they produced a hit. So overall, I think this was a pretty good article. I think it explained pretty much everything that people kind of already thought about the game. It started off as a multiplayer game because EA wanted to shift the focus to multiplayer games in general. Bioware didn't know how to make multiplayer games very well, especially after Anthem, but after that debacle, they wanted to change it back into a single-player game. There was a lot of leadership that left because of the initial multiplayer change into the game, and once it was shifted, they were already working on the multiplayer version, and they weren't allowed to restart the game from the ground up because of how much money was already put into it. And then from there, it was kind of already doomed, at least in my personal opinion, especially if EA wanted them to try to reach the largest audience possible. They weren't able to just focus in on the Dragon Age audience and what makes Dragon Age games good in general. I think they did a pretty good job, in my personal opinion, making it a competent single-player experience. I definitely don't think it's anywhere near like a 3 out of 10. I still think it's at least an average game, but there was a lot of issues with it, specifically in regards to trying to appeal to literally everybody. I think that kind of caused the tone to be way out of whack when they tried to change the tone. It was only for a couple moments in the game. The rest of the game really just felt like Disney in general, and I think it was very eye-opening that the Mass Effect team was the one who actually made the end of the game. The Mass Effect team did the best part of the entire game. So hopefully that is good news for the next Mass Effect game, which already they've come out and said it was not going to have a similar tone to Dragon Age. But I did think it was cool in this article how the Dragon Age and Mass Effect teams actually worked together here, or, for the lack thereof, working together. And I think that also kind of helped out the game in the end, because there were some things that obviously the Mass Effect team was able to do because of budget reasons, and they were given money potentially by EA more than the Dragon Age team, and they wanted to make it a darker tone that was a little bit inconsistent throughout the game, but at least provided for some really good moments. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. I want to know down below in the comments, did you like or dislike Dragon Age Veilguard? Were some of the things in this article eye-opening to you as they were to me? And if you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe if you did like what you see here. And for my returning viewers, thank you guys so much as always. Please like the video if you liked the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace!